Janus was published in the early 2000s. It's a book about serial killers, written by a serial killer, Ian Brady. The Moors murders shocked the Western world back in the 1960s due to the nature of the crimes and also the setting. There's something about the swinging 60s with the weird hairstyles coupled with the desolate Yorkshire moors that has a kind of haunting effect. And of course, there are also the two police mugshots of the killers, which is enough to give anybody nightmares. Apparently there was a big backlash upon the release of this book. I don't actually remember any of this. I was a reader back in the early 2000s. I've always been a reader since the 1980s when I was a child. But in the early 2000s, I wasn't reading as much as I read now. I wasn't reading like a book every 2 weeks. It was more of a sporadic thing. And this publication completely passed me by. Throughout the book, Ian Brady gives his opinions on some of the most famous serial killers in history. Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, the Boston Stranglers, Dean Corll, the Yorkshire Ripper, who's the other one? The Night Stalker, and Jeffrey Dahmer as well, I think. So it has a real The Silence of the Lambs feel to it. It's a bit like Hannibal Lecter talking about serial killers in that film. And throughout the book, he tries to justify his own crimes. As well as talking about other killers, he talks about himself as well. And he makes an attempt to kind of justify his crimes. And he uses several arguments to do this. He points out that society in general is very murderous and psychotic. You've got real-life psychopaths in the world of business who kind of screw each other over. He points out that politicians around the world start wars, and these wars result in a much higher body count than the serial killer average body count. You know, like a war usually results in millions of deaths, whereas the average serial killer only kills about 5 victims. He talks about that. He points out the fact that soldiers kill people with no remorse if it's legal, if they're ordered to do so. And he also points out, or he uses the argument of moral relativism throughout the book as well. The idea of this is that there's no universal right and wrong. All of these laws and regulations are arbitrary, and they're invented by human beings in government. And one country might have different rules and regulations to another country on the other side of the world. So there's no right or wrong. These are valid points, and they're quite interesting, and they're worth considering. But as I was reading this, an obvious flaw kind of jumped out at me. I mean, he criticises these evil politicians and soldiers throughout the book, but he did the same thing. If politicians are evil for being murderous, so is he. You know, he did the same thing. And as for this idea of moral relativism, if Ian Brady had been getting murdered by somebody, would he have been lying on the ground thinking, oh, this is okay because there's no right and wrong? You know, it's very easy to say that if you're the perpetrator, but not the victim. However, scumbag or not, Ian Brady was very intelligent, and I can tell that. I know that after reading this book. The prose is very lofty. It's very well written. He had a vast vocabulary, and his insight into these killers, the way he talks about their crimes and analyses them, indicates that he was very switched on, very articulate, and it kind of highlights an important point here. intelligence and a high IQ isn't necessarily linked to benevolence. A lot of evil people, a lot of nasty criminals in the world are very smart, and they've got a very high IQ, and they're very intelligent. They might not have gone to uni, but they are smart, and that's worth remembering. In fact, it's fairly common for serial killers to have a high IQ. Ted Bundy was very smart and very literate. And there's another one from the 90s, I think, called Lawrence Bittaker. If you ever want to research a horrific serial killer, look up this man, Lawrence Bittaker. He once was put for an IQ test in prison, and he got something like his scores in something like 150 or 160. And there was another one called Gary Heidnik, also from the 90s, I think. The 90s, the 60s to the 90s was like a very prolific time for serial killers. You don't get as many these days for reasons that I suspect I know. But Gary Heidnik, he was another prolific killer with a high IQ. So it's actually quite common for killers to be very smart and very savvy. I'm not going to go through every chapter of this book and tell you everything I've read. What I'm going to do instead is just list some random things that I learned from reading this book, some random snippets. I learned that most serial killers are not actually motivated by killing. Most killers are motivated by power or sex. The reason they kill their victims is not because they particularly want to, it's because they want to cover up their crimes. If they let the victim live, they would go and report the crime to the police, and then the killer would get arrested. So they're not motivated by killing. If a lot of them wouldn't kill if they could get away without doing so. Also, most killers are either psychopathic or psychotic, or a mixture of both. If they're psychopathic, it means they're very cold, they're very cool and very calculated, and they're very logical, and they'll go to extreme lengths to cover up their crimes and not get caught. Whereas if they're psychotic, their brain is a big whirlwind, their brain is a mess, and they might just go out there and snatch a victim from the high street in front of loads of witnesses, and then after they kill them, they might dump the body out in the open in a field where people are obviously going to find it. Psychotics are very messy and careless, whereas psychopaths are very careful and cunning. I also learned that this Silence of the Lambs style arrangement, where the police ask a serial killer to help them catch a killer at large, is actually a real thing. I thought it just happened in that film, but apparently Ian Brady himself was approached in prison, I think more than once, by the police, and they asked for his advice to try to catch some killers. I don't know the details, but it's actually a real thing. It makes sense, I suppose. You know, to catch a killer, you should ask a killer how they think. So it's a real thing. I also learnt that Ian Brady had personal contact with John Wayne Gacy in America. Now, personal contact could mean that they just wrote letters to each other. It's not really explained in the book, but that took me by surprise. Even though they're both serial killers, I wouldn't have linked the two of them together. And by the way, John Wayne Gacy is famous for dressing up as a clown and going to children's parties. After he was arrested, he used to paint clown paintings in his prison cell. He used to do clown paintings. He did loads of them. And one of them actually sold for $33,000. There's a Gacy painting out there, a clown painting, and somebody paid 33 grand for it. I also learnt in this book that psychiatrists as a group have the highest suicide rate. Brady was talking mainly about prison psychiatrists here, but I don't know, it might apply to all psychiatrists, but prison psychiatrists particularly tend to commit suicide. They have a high suicide rate. And it makes sense, you know. As I was reading this book myself, and I was listening to these twisted views, and I was reading these, you know, like where he's trying to excuse his crimes and he's coming out with moral relativism theories. I was reading it thinking, bloody hell, I hope I don't get persuaded by this, you know. And if you're a prison psychiatrist, you spend every day of your life with prisoners and murderers, listening to their warped opinions and warped views. And I suppose it's inevitable that it's going to have some kind of effect on your psyche. And apparently a lot of them actually kill themselves. Another little interesting fact I learned is when Ted Bundy was getting prepared to get sent to the electric chair, when they were kind of prepping him up, obviously that they shaved their head, that they shaved Ted Bundy's head. You have to do that with the electric chair. And they shaved one of his legs because electrodes get attached to their head and one of their legs. But they also put a wad of absorbent material up his arse in case he shat himself. And they also put a catheter into his penis in case he pissed himself as well. That's like a morbid little fact for you there. And finally, I also learned about a woman called Veronica Compton. There's a chapter in this book where Brady talks about the Boston Strangler. The Boston Strangler was actually two different men working together. And one of them was called Bianchi. Now, there was an aspiring actress and playwright called Veronica Compton. And she had an obsession with serial killers, right? And she wrote a screenplay. And the screenplay was about a female serial killer who kills victims and then inserts male semen into the victims to mislead the police. So the police think that it's a male serial killer and not a woman. She then sent this screenplay to Bianchi, one of the Boston Stranglers. He wrote back to her and said, yeah, I love your story, come and see me. And they started seeing each other. This woman fell in love with him, and Bianchi, the Boston Strangler, persuaded her to go out and do this thing for real in an attempt to mislead the police to thinking he wasn't the Boston Strangler. So on one of her visits, he secretly gave her a plastic glove filled with his semen. She then took the glove. She went out to some bar in America, picked up a woman, took her back to a hotel and tried to kill her with the intention of inserting the Boston Strangler's semen into her vagina. But she failed. The woman escaped. She went to the police, and then they arrested this woman, Veronica Compton, and she received a life sentence for it. This was back in the 70s, I think, and she was in prison up until 2003, and then she died in 2023. I mean, what kind of idiot would you have to be to do this? It's quite common, by the way. A lot of serial killers have female admirers. The Night Stalker had loads of women turning up to his court cases, and I think Ted Bundy had loads of women who lusted after him as well. Thank you for making it to the halfway point of this video. This is a quick message to let you know that I have a range of horror and sci-fi horror books available, and some of them are completely free. If you enjoy my videos, you might also enjoy my stories, so why not have a look? And if you'd like to receive fortnightly updates regarding the world of horror and weird literature, as well as book recommendations and prize giveaways, consider joining my mailing list. You'll even receive free horror audiobooks for doing so, written by me and narrated professionally. Finally, if you want to support my work, you can make a donation to my PayPal tip jar. All the links are below. Thank you. Now back to the video. This book is the opposite of a lot of serial killer books out there. It's an observation of mine after reading quite a few serial killer books that a lot of them are what I would describe as Wikipedia books. They feel as though an amateur researcher has gone onto Wikipedia and copied and pasted the text into a manuscript and then slightly edited it and then just released it. A lot of these serial killer books are quite cheap. This is different. This has a certain quality to it. For obvious reasons, it's actually written by a serial killer. So even though it's, you can't condone the author's crimes and all that, it does have a certain authenticity to it. Apparently, Ian Brady earned $5,000 from this book, but it might have gone to his mum instead of him, which makes me wonder what his mother was like and what she thought about her son's crimes. I've got no idea. This book was quite an experience, and I certainly won't forget it in a hurry. I will mention though, I do recommend reading this book if you're into serial killers, but I will say that only about 50% of it is actually Ian Brady talking about killers. There's a very long introduction and a long foreword by, I think, a psychiatrist who dealt with him, and the other one's a man who kind of worked with him on the book. So that's a long intro there, and then the middle section of the book is Ian Brady, and then after that there's a very long afterwards by a man called Peter Sotos, who's published a lot of books about killers and stuff. I don't actually like his writing. I kind of skimmed that section. He's got one of these writing styles that's way too convoluted, so I kind of skimmed that. And then afterwards, at the end of the book, there are some handwritten letters by Ian Brady. Letters of appeal where he was trying to get transferred or something. I didn't actually read those either because I read this book on a Kindle and the handwriting was just too small to read, so I just kind of skimmed that as well. So if you're into serial killers, I do recommend this book, but bear in mind it's only 50% of it is actually written by Ian Brady. The main reason I read this book is because I'm doing some research for a novel that I'm working on. This novel it's going to be a long time coming, but it does have a name. It's called Moonstruck Manor, so keep an eye out for that one. Thanks very much for watching. I'll be back in 2 weeks with another book review. In the meantime, try to have a good day on this psychopathic, psychotic, murderous piece of rock we call Earth. Lots of love. Goodbye.